Alright, hello, and welcome to Wednesday's Serial. This time we're doing something, I'm gonna drop that accent. We're doing something a little different this time, because this time is a surprise. Because I want to talk about what's in the box. What is in the box is a quantity of one. It is priced rather high, but I got it for much less. Roughly about half. It is 7.6 pounds of comic-y goodness. And it's apparently printed in China. Who knew? It's one of the premier comics, and it's going to lead into something that I've thought about before, but not really put a lot of serious thought into. But it's the sort of thing I certainly don't do often, but this time I had. Because I went ahead and purchased something for myself that I meant to do for a while. I got myself the Sandman Absolute Edition. Oh look, it's glaring the computer right there. Oh, that's a terrible look. Yes, the Absolute Volume 1 of Sandman. And for the uninitiated, I kind of thought I'd show what goes into an Absolute printing, because it's something I was curious about, and part of the reason I got this was just to satisfy that curiosity. It comes with its own cardboard covery thing, which is cool, and I cut it so that the plastic's still on to maintain my collector's boner for it. Leather bound with the and a, cut out cover bit, which is, for those of you who have ever talked to an actual printer and bounder and that sort of thing, this is a pretty impressive job. I mean, you can see the fold and everything there with little like silk bookmark deal. It's a very impressive bit. You go in, and your first real page is this kind of off-white paper to fold into the Sandman, and you're treated to 2 trades worth at full size. If you've ever seen a so full size, bam. And if you've ever seen a typical drawing mat that comic artists use, the place in which they draw is this space, this size. Of course, if you've seen those drawing boards, they also have a little bit for title and page and whodunit, a little bit at the bottom too, but it's here presented in full regale. And it's an impressive feat. There's a introduction in here, of course, and the introduction is actually one of the more profound introductions I've read. Paul Levitz did that for them in 2006, which means that was an introduction he wrote for one of the trades, because this was published later. 2003 is what I want to say, but I was wrong. It was 2006. I think 2003 about was when they published the first of the Absolutes, which was The Authority. It was the first one they did for whatever reason. I think they were trying to go through, and they had a plan. They're going to go through it alphabetically, but I think that just kind of fell apart, which is fine. But you go through, and you go through the comics at full size, and then you get to this miscellany, as they say, Volume 1, and that's where this edition, I think, probably takes off for some people. You get the full proposal from Neil Gaiman for the series, and you get to see some initial ideas for how Morpheus was to be drawn. You get an interesting preamble that Gaiman wrote for a collection that kind of deviated a little bit from what actually happened in some ways, offers a little bit of presentation, and then you get the full behind the scenes of A Midsummer's Night Dream, which, for the uninitiated, is the issue of Sandman that won it the multiple awards that it initially won, outside of comics and Eisner's and all that, but it was a notable moment for comics. And you get the script, and you get the penciled page printed. You get some interesting little bits, and you can see some kind of, it's not going to show up on camera here, but if you look behind the script, there's some really light outlines for kind of some, it's clearly not done by the artist because the layouts are much simpler, but to kind of give some positioning and idea, very much a writer trying to do a bit of a layout. And then there's Afterwards by Neil Gaiman, which are collected throughout the various collections that they've done, which is interesting. There's a separate one for the Absolute Sandman, which is entitled at the end Adrift in Time and Space, but very late, so I'm kind of curious if he was working on Doctor Who at the time. Time doesn't line up, though, so I guess not. Yeah. And it's quite an addition. And the reason I went and did the Absolute Sandman is it is the only collection of this caliber that I have any curiosity in. First of all, this first one, the first... Let's make sure I'm not lying here. The first 18 issues were recolored for this collection, which... I'm sure there's someone out there that's complaining that it's not the original coloring or whatever, but part of what didn't impress me so much about Sandman the first time around was the art, and I thought it was the art through and through, but after seeing the coloring and probably having a little more of a eye for talent and variety than when I first read the Sandman, the recoloring does it wonders. And so that's very interesting here. The second volume, which I've looked at, apparently has a few miscellaneous pages of Sandman that were done, one in association with a statue, and so it was recollected for that second volume. And if you're curious, the Sandman arc itself, the 60-issue Vertigo brass ring, is collected in the first 4 Sandman Absolute volumes. The 5th one is various trades that have come out later, the Dream Hunters and Endless Nights. And that collection I have no personal desire to see in full absolute regalia. I own most of that stuff anyways. It also comes with the crossover between this 2 Sandman trade, which apparently is a rare thing to find now. I got it when I was younger, so no big honkin' deal for me there. I don't know if anyone else has looked for it recently. I hear rare, but I have a feeling it's probably not that hard to come by. Could be wrong. Like I said, haven't looked. But yeah, I think owning these 4 volumes and seeing the Sandman presented that way, especially given that the art goes across so many artists and you can kind of see some more details, and seeing in the Sandman when they do decide to do and kind of portray these more abstract ideas, it's a book that really speaks and could use a little more than other collections. And part of the reason I've never really cared about Absolutes before is that they're bigger arcs, sure, but really what's to be gained, I mean, from a nice hardbound, clearly a collector's sort of mantelpiece in a lot of ways. That's part of my problem when I see people who have a slew of these absolutes. It's like, do you really just read that once and put it down? I mean, I read a lot of comics, read them once and put them down, but they're stuff I've gotten on the cheap, whatever. But when you pay $100, and I paid about $50, but pay $100 for this collection, just kind of read it, put it away, it seems like such a waste, especially when you have these collections where some of the back matter and whatnot adds so much to the comic. Now, part of the reason that I was kind of unsure about getting the Absolute Sandman was, I believe it was earlier last year, only a month ago now, but last year, they came out with the annotated Sandman, which I'm actually really curious to read as well now, because to see where certain things go and line up, and there's one page in particular when Orpheus is walking through hell. He sees this woman. She goes, I love you, and can you forgive me to release me from hell? She says, and he's like, I remember you, I love you, but I do not forgive you. And I'm sure it's this literary, I'm inclined to believe biblical reference, but I don't know. And I would like to know. And I could probably look it up on my own right, but to have an annotated and see all those sort of references, not only the ones that I'm curious about, but ones that I might be completely oblivious to, and to kind of learn more from that, it would be an interesting and worthwhile read for that. So I'm kind of considering that maybe someday, but for now, rebuying most of the Sandman once is enough. I did own a chunk of Sandman trades before, of which I've never actually really read. Most of the reading I did was from the library back in the day, but fun comic collecting story. I once was at a comic store, and it got more interesting than that. I was kind of hanging out, checking out whatever, and I saw this guy come in with some pile of books, and just went up to the register and said, hey, I have these signed Sandman trades. Would you be interested in buying them off me for whatever? And the lady's like, well, we don't buy comics here. And it's kind of like, what? Wait, signed Sandman trades? You're not gonna... Okay. So I went and talked to the guy, and I was like, well, what were you looking for him? I mean, no real host, but I was just curious and kind of wanted to see him. And he said, oh, well, I was thinking, like $40. It was like per trade, and I was thinking like $20 per trade. Maybe they're older, maybe they're worth more. I don't know if they're signed. So, and he's like, no, 40 for the whole pile. So, I was like, sweet. And so I have these volumes, one of which is hardback, and retailed at $30 back in the day, which, wow, right? And then a couple of these were just signed by Neil, but a few of them were signed to Mark, interestingly enough. So Mark, if you have any interest, I don't know, but it's curious to see these trades, and one of these trades is actually a different named volume than what you'll see in a collection now, because there's one or two breaks from the original trade set that they did where they would print the arcs, but some of the issues in between fell through and were not collected. Now when they collect it, they collect the entirety. And so when they went back and did that, they renamed the trades to reflect that it was something new with a bit more material. And one of these is the older ones that do not contain those stories. So, interesting little bit there. So, I'm excited to once again read The Sandman, which is just, undisputably one of the classics, one of those great comics that just ventures outside of where comics normally goes, but is interesting because especially in the first volume with the Sandman, it was tied to DC in some bizarre and interesting ways, and to see it handled and then to see where it goes is such a treat. And it's so bizarre because I'm sitting here reading, especially the first issue, you know, I'm like, I would have not continued with this if I had just read the first issue at all. It would have not hooked me. I would have not been so curious, but then to go on and to get so much more out of it, it's just interesting, kind of makes you think and realize sometimes, you know, sometimes these stories earn their keep, but it's really rough if they don't hook you right away. So I don't know. I'm curious to think what you guys would say about Absolute Editions, if any of you own them or if any of you are kind of coveting one. I just don't understand so much of the appeal. Even something like the Dark Knight Returns, well, it's the Dark Knight collection, they have both of those, the Dark Knight Returns and the Dark Knight Strikes Again in there, and I don't really care what Frank Miller has to say about that. It's kind of, and to see that in full size, I don't think you'd get any more of the art because it's kind of so unpacked already. Ronin, I mean, I don't know what more you're going to get out of that than a trade, kind of same deal. I mean, even like the Long Halloween, which is a Batman story I love and I think is great and is wonderful. I just would have no desire to own an Absolute edition of that. It doesn't make sense to me. And there's a lot of other collections like that. I haven't seen any Wonder Woman stories done in this regard. And then there's a few Batman, then I've only seen the 2 Superman. One which made sense, All-Star Superman. I wouldn't, but I understand where others would want that. I think it's For Tomorrow is collected an edition like that, and I can't understand where the idea is there. I would be curious about Watchmen, but unless the back matter really is something that amazing, I'd almost rather just get a supplemental book to Watchmen than the Absolute. Though there are certain pages that I would like to see a little more splayed out to maybe more easily see and gain and understand all the minutiae there. And that's a book that certainly deserves the treatment. Curious if any of you would be curious in ones that haven't gotten the treatment, because there's a couple I was saying, like, the ending kind of muddled, but why The Last Man? Why isn't that there? Someday DMZ would make a lot of sense to me, especially to have kind of some notes and kind of see where Brian would kind of put together the city and all that. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting notes to that comic in particular that haven't necessarily seen the light of day. Transmetropolitan baffles me as to why there isn't this collection, but more than any that I'm confused about, and you'll notice a trend here, but Preacher is one that absolutely baffles me. That has fairly consistently been a top-selling sort of book, and for them to not re-release it with that sort of incentive for people, I don't know. I mean, I can see it on the other hand, it's Preacher, so kind of a nice, fine, clean treatment doesn't necessarily fit. Yeah, I mean, outside of that, I mean, in your more general DC, I couldn't necessarily see anything being so robust. I mean, a lot of their big crossover stuff they've given the treatment to, but it doesn't feel right. Like Final Crisis, really, I mean, no. If they could collect Secret Six in one volume, but it's too much, and I don't know how much you could add. I love Secret Six, but it just doesn't seem like anything would be gained, or would it really be worth that kind of a treatment. I don't know, it's weird to see the books that they put in here and then what they go for, and it just rarely makes that much sense. So I don't know, there you go. But curious to think, name your number 1 Absolute entry below, like, subscribe, and I'll catch you soon with another comic review.